Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer back with the latest live stream of the Social Change Career Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking with Mohammed Lila, who is the founder of Goodable, which is one of the world's coolest tech platforms doing kind of journalism and using AI for social good. So I was just having a little bit of a LinkedIn challenge. We'll see if that works. And I'll edit this out in the audio version. So we might just be on YouTube. Anyway, so for people who have not joined the live stream previously, we generally go about 70 minutes. If you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn, we deeply enjoy hearing from you. So please feel free to share your comments, questions, resources. We try to read them throughout the conversation. I think this is season 15. I think we're in podcast number 203 or 204. When the audio episode comes out, I'll make sure to have that. So 3 quick requests. Please follow Mohammed on LinkedIn. Please check out Goodable. Consider subscribing. Consider checking out and all the different services they provide, both for individuals and organizations and companies. Please check out PCDN, all of our resources. And whether it's this podcast or any podcast, the number one thing you can do for any podcast creator or host is share and rate it. So it's about 98% of people doing podcasts. It's a labor of love. And just if you share, it helps grow the impact. So that's the quick request. I'm going to just check one more time to see if I can get LinkedIn working. And if not, we've got people on YouTube. I'm trying a new setting today. Okay. So Mohammed anchored CP24 and CBC before spending a decade at ABC News and CNN, where he delivered more than almost 700 live reports from hostile environments and received an Emmy nomination for best breaking news coverage during the Manchester concert attack. In 2019, he stepped away from the front lines to become an entrepreneur in residence at Camelback Ventures. Just a little plug for Camelback. They do amazing work. And they have all kinds of cool programs for founders, particularly in the impact space. So make sure to check them out. Built on the idea that the internet did not have to make people feel worse. And now with AI slop, it's getting much worse. So that's kind of where he founded Goodable shortly after that. The platform's AI is clinically proven to reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression by up to 64%. Since founding Goodable, Mohammed has been accepted into the On Deck Fellowship, another great program, the UCSF Rosenman Institute Innovators Program, and Hub 71 in Abu Dhabi. He's based near Toronto. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. So Mohammed, and I have to say, I'm a user of Goodable and also a tiny angel investor in Goodable through a syndicate, and have seen it kind of grow, and really also just have a lot of interest in this. And I do a lot of work with AI for impact and the good and the bad. So I just love seeing examples of companies and organizations that are building ethical AI approaches that really can have a benefit for humanity. And one quick story before I get started. So my son's 15 now, we used to do a lot of reading before bed. And one of the things we would often do is look at the Goodable app and look at the news stories. And, and particularly I would say he's a very competitive athlete. So partially on the sports news, but there's science and tech and business and culture. So it used to be really fun just to be like, what is good out there? So Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us today. And just to start off with, can you talk a little bit about how in the world, like when did this origin story for creating Goodable come about? And then, first you built a very successful and impactful career as a war journalist. So how long has this idea been germinating, and what caused you to make that change?
Craig, first of all, thanks for that lovely introduction. It's always nice to meet people who know all about you before you even start speaking, and I feel like you've definitely done your research. So thank you for that. To answer your question, I think we need to just go back a little bit and add a little bit of context. So I grew up in the city of Toronto, which is a very diverse city. If you've ever been here, it's one of the most diverse cities in the world. And just like you used to, read Goodable stories with your son at night, I used to watch the news at night. Every night at 10 o'clock, I had a ritual in my home where my father would turn on The National, which was our national newscast, broadcast on the CBC. He would, have some grapes, and I'd have my milk and cookies. And for years, that was my routine at night. We'd watch The National together. And so I grew up watching correspondents on television who had very funny sounding names. At least they were funny sounding to me. And I remember those names today: Ian Hannah-Mansing, Anna Maria Tremonti, Joe Schlesinger, Harold Hussein. Like, these were, in those days, those weren't sort of like run-of-the-mill names, and they were sort of permanently imprinted on my brain. And I grew up watching these people, and I used to think, wow, that must be so cool to be standing in front of the Berlin Wall as it's coming down. Or that must be so interesting to be like in Iraq during the first Gulf War or the second Gulf War. And I watched these people and I kind of just thought, I'd love to do that one day. And they all have a funny sounding name, and I kind of have a funny sounding name, so maybe I would fit right in. So I grew up knowing that journalism was my calling. I would read the newspaper, like the physical newspaper, every morning. I'd read the sports section. I'd memorize the box scores. Like, I would just read anything I could get my hands on. And so I went to school for journalism. Got my first job as a producer. Worked my way up very quickly to becoming a local reporter, then anchor, then international correspondent with ABC and CNN. And I was really living my dream. All I ever wanted to do from the time I was young was be a correspondent for CNN. Like, really, that's first CBC, and then I did that, and then CNN, and I was able to do that. And what I realized towards the end of my time at CNN, I was averaging 100 flights a year. The most number of flights I ever took in a single year is 142, I think. So I was traveling a lot. I was on the road a lot. I didn't mind the pressure. I didn't mind the stress. I'm very comfortable in hostile environments. But I wasn't happy. And I think a lot of people come to this point in their career where maybe they're making good money, or, they have a high prestige job or something like that. But there's something inside them that tells them that there's something more out there. And it can be quite scary, because all I'd ever known was how to tell stories. And I'm really good at it. And I reached this point in CNN where I said I had become the person on television who was showing people how bad the world is. I've covered explosions, earthquake, assassinations, terror attacks, wars, diplomacy, famine, plane crashes. Like, I don't even remember the number of plane crashes that I've covered. And I did it all because I believe that the world needs to see who we are as a human species. We need to see the depths of depravity that we're capable of. And I realized that I could spend the rest of my life showing people how bad the world is, or I could dedicate the rest of my life to showing people how good the world can be. And I knew that the world needed to see good things, and nobody was delivering it to them at scale. So I walked away from my career and my job at CNN, and I set out to build something that would harness the power of news feeds to change the world, and harness the power of news feeds to make the world better. In the early days, I had no idea how to do it. Like, I'd never built a startup. I'd never raised money. I'd never hired people. I never put together a business plan. I didn't do any of that stuff. So I did the only thing that came natural to me. I started sharing and posting stories about good things happening in the world. And, if you're an engineer, you'll build some software. If you're an architect, you'll design a new bridge. As a storyteller, I just started telling stories. I just did what I knew how to do, and it came natural to me. And it really, really grew. If you think about maybe 8 years ago, the world just suddenly got really negative all of a sudden. Like, I don't think the world has been as negative, or we feel it as though it's more negative today than it's ever been in history. But the question I ask people is, do you believe there's more good in the world than bad? Let me ask you that, Craig. Do you believe there's more good in the world than bad?
I think the good forces far outweigh the bad forces, but there's a lot of systematic challenges. So I think at the individual level, there's so much more good. Systems level, I think a lot of the systems are fundamentally exploitative and extractive. So
that's a really good answer. In fact, it's one of the better answers I've ever heard. The question that I always think about when people give me that answer is, well, okay, if on an individual level there's more good in the world than bad, why don't we see it? Right? Like, we see it on an individual basis. Maybe your neighbor gives you a ride to work, or somebody helps you with a spare tire. Like, we see that. But those small acts of goodness happen at scale in the tens of millions every single day. We don't look at those things as news, but when, a car crashes and causes some damage, suddenly that's a big news event. And I just became obsessed with this problem of why. Why is it that when good things happen, we don't consider it as news, but when bad things happen, it makes the front page or, the landing page of every website? And that was the problem that I set out to solve. I said, could we harness the power of news feeds to heal the world rather than harm the world? And it was scary because nobody was doing it, right? And even people within the industry, they used to kind of like denigrate it and mock it and say, oh, this is never going to take off. You're never going to make money. You're never going to scale. Like, you're painting the world with rose colored glasses. And I understand where they're coming from, because if not everybody can walk away from something that they're good at to try to do something even more. It's like how Michael Jordan, I'm not saying I'm at his level, but Michael Jordan quit basketball so he could go play baseball. Like, people looked at him and like, what are you doing? And the first half of the season that he played in minor league baseball, he was really bad. And people ignore the fact that the second half of that season, he actually played really good. So he figured it out. He said, look, I've done what I needed to do in basketball. Let me try my hand at baseball. And he actually wound up getting good at it. And so a lot of people don't take that risk because it's scary. It's really scary to walk away or step outside of your comfort zone and do something that you want to do, but fear or apprehension or self-worth, all those things hold you back. And so when I shifted from covering war zones to building Goodable, it was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. I've been ambushed by the Taliban in the mountains of Afghanistan. ISIS tried to kill me. I've been stopped at checkpoints by armed gunmen more like at least 2 or 3 times. I've had an AK-47 pointed at my head in Ukraine on the ground in the middle of a firefight. Building a startup was scarier than all of those things, because when you're in a war zone, you know who the threat, you know where the threats are coming from, you know who the bad actors are. When you're building a startup, you don't know these things. You don't know where the threats are coming from. They could come from your own team, like you don't know. And it was terrifying, but that sort of explains why I chose the path that I did.
Amazing. I've had, I've been in lots of conflict zones. I haven't had guns pointed at me, but I have had friends who've been kidnapped and shot. And, I haven't, but I have left things that were stable and normal to do something else, and can understand, the absolute angst and terror, but also excitement and like this roller coaster of, have done that multiple times. And it keeps, I think it keeps one's young. It keeps me young, at least engaged, but it's also terrifying. And people are like, what are you doing? But I want to ask a question about journalism, then we'll come back to Goodable and how you made the pivot. But so a couple of questions on journalism. So for younger people, our average age is, let's say, 25 to 45, from all over the world, people already working in the impact sector, or people aspiring to. And the whole nature, and we'll talk about, Goodable and solutions journalism and things like that. But for people who want to work in journalism, when someone comes to you and says, like, you built this very successful high impact career in journalism, and what is your advice to people who want to get out there and tell stories in terms of like career paths and upskilling? And is there even, journalism, there's a lot of layoffs and downsizing and AI slop. Some smaller outlets are thriving. Just like your advice for people like, I want to tell or help cover stories.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question. Like, you could teach an entire semester on sort of like how to answer that question. A couple of things come to mind. Number one is that it's never been easier in history to build your own audience as it is today. And what that means is, if you're a storyteller, you can actually go directly to your audience. You don't need to work at a local newspaper or website or, big news network. You can actually just start telling stories now. There are a ton of people right now, thanks to, X, formerly known as Twitter, or Instagram or elsewhere, who became quote unquote journalists with zero training, zero editorial like instinct. They just started telling stories, and they started interviewing people and posting those clips. And like, that can happen. That can absolutely happen. The biggest example of this is, if you're in the world of tech, there was like, the Tech Bros podcast network. There were a couple of guys who just started live streaming about like world technology news. And I think they were based in SF. And 18 months later, they got acquired for like $100 million. Like, they literally just live streamed them talking about, tech news, and it grew. So the first thing is, I think, start thinking about growing your own audience. The second thing is more philosophical and ideological. I meet people all the time who want to become journalists for all the wrong reasons. For example, maybe you're from a minority group, or you have a particular political background that you come from, particular political belief or worldview, and you feel like that worldview is not being shown enough in what they say is mainstream news. And so you go into journalism because you say, I want my people to be represented. I want this perspective to be represented. I feel like, in this global conflict, we don't hear enough about this side or that side. That's a very noble and good reason to go into journalism. But to be a real journalist, and I don't mean commentator, I don't mean like host, I mean be an actual journalist, you have to have a commitment to the truth. And most of us actually don't know the truth. That's why I actually prioritize being in the field all the time. Because when I'm in Ukraine, I can see with my own eyes how Russians are taking over the country. Right? I can see with my own eyes the effect that drone attack had on this building and the family that's suffering. It's not the same as reading it. It's not the same as coming in and saying, "Oh, I read about this, but they're not saying this." Like, you have to go on the ground and you have to break bread with people and you have to sit with them and learn their stories. And when you do that, it opens up your mind to different possibilities. For example, it opens up your mind to the possibility that maybe you were wrong, right? Like maybe you felt that it's hard to come up with an example right now, but let's say there's a global conflict, and you're like, oh well, this side's story is never being told. Well, if you go on the ground, like in Ukraine, for example, when the war was kicking off, there were atrocities committed by both sides. I mean, this is just completely understood that it wasn't just one side was pure evil and one side was good. War is very gray, and bad things happen on both sides. Now, if you go in with a perception or like a belief system that says, no, your side only does good, that's wrong. Things happen in real life that live in gray. And to be a real journalist, you have to abandon that. You have to abandon these preconceptions that you have. Not saying that you shouldn't want to represent the group that you're from or try to inject more balance or integrity into journalism. But you also have to accept the possibility that you're wrong. And you have to accept the possibility that someone could prove that you're wrong. And if you're wrong, like you sort of have to update your belief system. And I really wish more journalists would do that, because what we see today is not sort of like old school journalism. It's a lot of just opinion masquerading as journalism. I have an opinion. I made successful arguments. Therefore, I am right. And a lot of journalism is like this. I'm right. You're right. And all these clippable, when you get a clip of like a podcast or something, it's always somebody making a point. And the people that share that clip are the people that believe in that point. But there's always counter arguments to that point that never get addressed. So I think the main thing is just have a commitment to the truth and be ready to accept that you might be wrong.
Thank you so much. And maybe two more questions on the journalism aspect. So one, it's never been easier to tell stories and build an audience, but it's also harder than ever just because there's so much competition and information. And so in terms of skills, obviously it depends what type of media someone might want to do, but any thoughts on kind of how do you actually make a living at this? Because, there are lots of great new media outlets like the 19th in the US and Grist and Manga Bay. Well, they're not new, but there's a lot of really good outlets, New Humanitarian, that are doing incredible reporting. But a lot of the bigger media platforms are consolidating, laying off. So just any thoughts on like skills, and also just does becoming there's a difference between journalism and communication and marketing. But if you're really at that intersection of journalism, are there actually enough jobs out there, or you've got to hustle all the time?
It's a really good question. I'll answer sort of like the market and the economics behind it in a second. But the number one thing that will set any journalist apart is your ability to be a great storyteller. You can't settle for being an ordinary storyteller. You have to be a great one. And nobody knows how to be a great storyteller when they start. It's really hard. AI sort of can't really help you with that. You have to listen really well. You have to understand what people are saying, and then you have to understand how to package what people are saying into a story that keeps people at the edge of their seat. The example I was given of storytelling is that it's not like an apple where you're biting into an apple and each bite is really tasty and delicious, and by the end it's done. It's more like unpeeling an onion. And so if you think of a story, each element of the story should unpeel a new layer that shows the viewer something new that they weren't expecting. And you can actually take people on this lovely emotional journey with like twists and turns and revelations so that by the end, the user is or the reader is just like, wow, like he just painted a picture for me in strokes. And I started from the first stroke, and now by the end, the entire canvas is painted. To me, that's what storytelling is. And very, very, very few people focus on this, especially if you're on video or you're on television, because a lot of it is about the optics. How do I look? How's my hair? How do I sound? Is my name sort of like the right name? Um, but if you just keep your head down and you focus relentlessly on how do I tell an amazing story that forces people to pay attention. Remember when you were in kindergarten? Like I had this in kindergarten where we used to just have like a reading circle. And I think it was every morning, and my teacher would just read from like a children's book. And man, that was better than any IMAX movie that I've ever seen because I just loved it. And the teacher would tell a story, and it was, about like a bear or a cub or Jungle Book or something. And wow, man, could those kindergarten teachers tell stories? And so I think the idea for this is learn how to be that kindergarten teacher and simplify story into its most basic ingredients. If, as a young journalist, you can do this, you will have a home anywhere. The reason CNN and ABC hired me from Canada was because they saw the quality of my storytelling. It wasn't because I was a handsome looking, rugged looking correspondent. It's because I knew how to tell stories and I knew how to layer sound and audio and video and weave it through a narrative that made people care. So that would be my advice. In terms of the economics, yeah, it sucks. Like journalism got hit really hard. I think AI is completely transforming the way people consume information. The business model of journalism is doing much worse than people think it is, because in fact, the current business models mostly rely on advertising. So you go to a site, you read the article, and there's an ad attached to it, and if you click on the ad, the company makes money. Well, people won't be going to sites anymore. They're just going to go to Claude or OpenAI and say, give me the 5 biggest stories that happen overnight. And Claude will give them an answer. So like, that's a really tough problem that I don't think enough news organizations are willing to confront. And it's unfortunate because at some point, if AI replaces journalism, I don't know where that leaves the entire industry. It's kind of scary to think about that.
And it is interesting because there's a lot more independent journalists are setting up kind of their own subscription models, whether it's on Beehive, Substack, or somewhere else. And I do pay for journalism, but there's like a limit to what I'll pay. But I subscribe to New York Times, Guardian. I don't pay, but I'll contribute. But like Wired, MIT Tech, like the ones that are doing really high quality journalism, often they'll build that audience and somehow sustain themselves. But subscription models are not going to sustain journalism either, because we've hit platform subscription overload. So
I think
just
what
two
will
more
happen,
questions.
Craig, I think what will happen with that is that everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, but most journalists will be free agents.
Mhm.
And they'll reach their audience directly and they'll monetize through Substack or Beehive or something like that, or Newsphere, for example. Um, and the traditional networks will bring in the free agents as needed. So rather than having like, the old model was, Anderson Cooper, right? Like rugged, goes out to the field, gets amazing interviews, and then gets his own show at CNN. I think that will happen less. And what will happen more is Anderson Cooper will have his own audience on his own platforms, not him specifically, but the next Anderson Cooper will have his own audience or her audience on their own platforms. And CNN will call them in once in a while to host a series or host a town hall or something like that. I think that'll be the future. And it'll be like everyone's a free agent and your value is tied to the size of the audience that you bring in.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question on journalism. So, there's a saying, at least if it bleeds, it leads. And so I'm curious, just thinking about, we'll get to Goodable next, but if you think about there's 2 questions there. So one is like, what was the motto that framed, there's difference between working for a public broadcaster than a commercial one, but did you have a phrase? And just as a journalist, doing so many stories, like, how did you think about impact? So the idea is like whether it's a horrific incident or a conflict or something happy, like either for you individually as a journalist or the networks you worked for, like what did it mean to do a story and then like the so what? Like, and that, then we'll get into Goodable.
It's interesting because for most journalists, we don't really think about the so what very much, right? We're so, and again, by journalist, I mean like people that are on the ground, not opinion people who masquerade as journalists.
Mm-hmm.
For people on the ground, our job was to report what we see, report the facts, and that's it. Like, we didn't really worry about the outcome. So, for example, if I was reporting in Syria during the war and I was saying, hey, government forces announced that they're about to lose this city, or government forces announced that they've just killed, 10,000 militants. If I report that, I'm not thinking about, oh, well, how will other militants respond to this? Will they go and attack even harder now and
Mm-hmm.
cause more loss of life? Or will the government respond by cracking down on more protests? Like, I'm sort of not thinking about that. I'm saying I just need to report what happened. And I think that's sort of the right approach. But in traditional journalism, you don't like, the journalist doesn't really think about so what, or what's the consequences of my action. We know when we make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I say, I remember at CNN, I was talking about the political negotiations between two countries. And I was like, man, if I make a mistake and I mention the wrong country by accident, like I'm accidentally starting a war.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I say like, hey, Iran and the US are negotiating, but they've reached an impasse. If I make a mistake and I say Iran and Saudi are negotiating, but they reached an impasse, like, whoa, everybody's just going to say, oh, I had no idea that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
So we worry about our mistakes and we don't worry about the outcome. When we launched Goodable, one of the first things we did was we started mining and analyzing emotional impact data, because I really cared about the effect that content has on a person's brain. And it's actually pretty simple. Like the clinical data is immense and extraordinary, and we have a great science team that has helped us with this. But at the core, when you break it down, if you, Craig, see an image of a car on fire, it will trigger an emotion in your mind. If you see an image of a dead baby, it will trigger an emotion. If you see a couple hugging each other on the beach at sunset, like, it will trigger an emotion. Every piece of stimulus that your brain receives triggers an emotion. We know this with movies. We know this with Hollywood. We know this with music. We know this with everything. For some reason, when it comes to news, nobody thought to sort of turn that spotlight on news and say, well, what's the emotional impact of the content that we read every day? And it's shocking because news feeds are everywhere. An average person consumes at least 6 hours of content every single day. None of it is measured for emotional impact, especially when it comes to news. And so we said, well, wait a minute. If news avoidance, meaning people that are avoiding the news, is at a historic level, it's almost 1 out of every 2 people no longer consumes news. When you ask them why, they say it's because it puts them in a bad mood. So we said, okay, let's figure this out. Let's figure out why it's putting people in a bad mood to begin with. What is it about the writing and the images and the words and the context and the relationship between them? And we set out to solve that problem very early so that we could understand how news feeds, and by extension, not just news, but all content, affects a user's brain. And if we could understand how it affects a user's brain, now we could harness its real power to help improve your brain, to help improve your emotional state, rather than kind of like slowly chipping away and making it worse. So that's what we did.
I was actually going to ask you about the amount of content that people consume. So you answered that question. So thinking about the origin story of Goodable. So we've talked about a little bit, when I did your intro, and you talked about it some. So can you talk about both your reflections? How did you decide to make the jump from something, let's say, high profile, somewhat stable, exciting, and that choice to do something different, and both your own reflections, but for people who might be in something stable, or at least something that's paying the bills, your thought process, like when, I mean, it's an individual decision for everyone, whether they can make the jump if they have financial responsibilities. Some countries like, US, you need health insurance, it's not public, but like your thought process and how you, like, how did you find Camelback Ventures? Did it just show up? And like, how did that help you refine your idea? And so kind of reflect on your journey, but also lessons for others who might be making those kind of crazy jumps or
So
considering it.
I think the people that are looking to make crazy jumps all have one thing in common, is that they want to make a difference in the world. And I really knew that I wanted to make a difference. It's the reason why I went into journalism. It's the reason why I'm building Goodable, which is now a very successful tech platform. But I knew I wanted to make a difference. When I stepped away from CNET, I just didn't know how. I was really lost. Like on an individual level, I was going through a really hard time. It was just hard because I went from being on television 10 times a day to being a nobody. And anyone that says being on TV doesn't fulfill your ego is not telling the truth. There's an aspect of it where you feel important when you're on television. And I see this with people that I interview. Like I've interviewed people at the lowest moments of their life, and before they go on TV, they'll make sure their makeup is perfect. Everybody sort of wants that validation of like being important. And I went from being very important to being a nobody, and it caused a crisis in me, and it was very, very difficult. What I will say is that being a founder isn't for everyone. You have to have a very thick skin. Ideally, you have a bunch of savings set aside so that you can go down that path. And it requires a humility where you have to accept that you don't know anything. Like when you're building a startup in the beginning, you don't know who your users are. You don't know how you're going to monetize. You don't know anything about this company. The best definition of startup that I've ever heard is that a startup is an exercise to see whether this company should even exist. That's what a startup is. You're just experimenting over and over again to see if you can solve a problem. And if you can solve someone else's problem, will they pay you for it? Until you figure that out, your company shouldn't really exist. And the moment like you become successful, now you're no longer a startup. So it's a really steep learning curve. If you, for all those people out there that want to be founders and want to go and change the world and make the world better, it's hard, but just start. That's what I would say, is find something small that you can start experimenting with very quickly and see if the world needs it. When I built Goodable, I didn't do any user research. I didn't talk to any investors and say, hey, if I build this, will you invest? I didn't do any of that. I built Goodable because I was convinced that the world needed it. And so for some people out there, if you're convinced that this idea that you have is something the world needs, for those crazy founders like me, that's the only validation that you need. The world needs this. Great. Go out and build it. If you're wrong, you've wasted a few months or a few years of your life. If you're right, maybe you'll go and change the world.
And how did Camelback Ventures? So can you even walk through a little bit like timing? So you left CNN and then you took 6 months off and meditated. You went and started like building. You did in-depth research. You found the scientific. So like a little bit of the steps. So you left, and not everything, but then how did you start building, and where did Camelback come in, and when did actually Goodable start to exist?
So it's a great question. When I was sort of just looking for like how to learn more about launching a company, and Camelback actually has like a Camelback fellowship program where they bring people from around North America and invest in them and give them programming on like, here's how building a startup works. And so I thought about applying for the fellowship, and I wound up just emailing their CEO, someone named Aaron Walker, who's just an incredible leader, an incredible person. He just has this personality where like, it doesn't matter what he's doing. When he's talking to you, he makes you feel like you're the most important person in the room. Mm-hmm. And I emailed him and I said, hey, like I'm interested in this fellowship. I'm thinking about building this thing Goodable. And he's like, hey, we could actually use a journalist on our team to like help promote what we're doing. And so it was very organic, the idea of becoming an entrepreneur in residence. And it was a really cool role because for the first time I was exposed to like the world of tech. I was exposed to the world of startups. All the programming that the fellows were going through, I was kind of there too. So like I got to sort of, it's like when you audit a university class, like I got to sit in on a lot of the sessions. So I learned a lot, and I just got to be around people who were struggling with the same problems, struggling to get financing, struggling to find product market fit, struggling to like build a product that people keep coming back to. And it was being around there and learning all those things where I actually became convinced. I said, no, I could do this. Like, it'll be hard, but I could do this. I saw those other fellows and I was like, you know what? I'm just as good as they are, and I'm going to go ahead and do this. And so we founded Goodable, I think, a couple of years later. And even when we formally founded Goodable, it was just the thing that we did on a piece of paper to say we have a company, but we didn't really start building until about a year later. I don't think, I think without Camelback, I might not have founded Goodable, which is crazy to think about because they didn't even invest in us. But I learned so much from that team that it changed the trajectory of my career.
Thank you so much. And there's a lot of incubators and accelerators and support networks out there. So there's so many ways to get support, whether you're a nonprofit or Fast Forward and Camelback Ventures and Capor Center. So if you're whether in the nonprofit or for-profit space, the ecosystem for support is so much more dynamic than it was. I mean, I'm 55, not say 30 years ago. Still not sufficient, but it's much better. So can you talk a little bit? So you had this piece, you had this vision. And if you had to think about like the theory of change, or we just had Eric Rice on the podcast Monday. I mean, the episode won't be released until end of May, but in his new book Incorruptible, and so if you have like this mission or spiritual vision for the company, he uses like spiritual companies, not in the religious sense, but mission driven. So if you had to think, if news is critical to inform citizens and to action in the world, but so many people are being disempowered and negatively impacted by the news. What was like the founding or early stage vision for Goodable, and has it stayed, close to that, or how has it pivoted over time?
No, that's a really good question, and it's actually probably the most important question about Goodable. On the outside, people look at us as though we're a media company, and we're not. We started as a media company. We started as a platform that was just creating and producing content that put out good news. But because we had such a small team, we built internal AI tools for ourselves, which were built on proprietary data that allows us to identify whether content was positive or negative. It was an internal tool that we only used ourselves to sort of improve our own workflow. What ended up happening last year was that we started getting inbound emails and messages from executives at very large organizations. So like Yahoo, Pinterest, Meta, large transit systems, airlines, they all sort of started reaching out to us and saying, hey, like your content is interesting, but like we already produce our own content. Is there a way that we could, like, to use it, I'm making up this word, but like goodableize our content to make it more goodable? And what we realized then was we could actually modify our AI so that we licensed it directly to other large enterprise customers. So we went from like a B2C model to a B2B model. And once we made that transition, our growth skyrocketed. I think we've grown 10 or 15 times, like 10 or 15 fold since where we were at this time last year. And it's all because our AI is really advanced and it's very difficult to copy. So we have the ability now to look at any piece of text or video or audio and tell you in real time how that content will emotionally impact your end user before they ever see it. So if you think of all the places that serve content, there's the platform, there's the user, and we sit right in between. And so we have our partners where before they even publish content online, it runs through our algorithms. Our algorithms provide emotional intelligence, which has never been done before. Mm-hmm. Our algorithms provide emotional intelligence to those platforms. So those platforms now have data to say, hey, if we serve this content at this point in time to this user, there's a 49% chance they're going to ignore it. Or there's a 99% chance it's going to make them outraged. In doing so, we went from like this media company to being an AI company that's building emotional intelligence for AI models. And it's really interesting because AI taught machines how to think. Goodable is teaching machines how to feel. And I think this is going to be the future of how all content is consumed. Just like it can personalize based on like your spending habits, AI will also be able to personalize based on how you feel at that moment. And it's crucial because every decision that we make in life is driven by emotion. what you purchase, what stores you go to, who you hang out with, even who you vote for. It's largely driven by emotion. Organizations haven't been able to measure how that content affects users emotionally until today. So that's the vision, and that's how we sort of transition. We didn't transition saying, "Hey, let's start as a media company and then grow into an AI company." The market made that decision for us.
Mm-hmm. And is this the IRIS system? Am I getting it correct? Is that the name of the tools you use, or I don't have
Yeah.
that correct?
So the tool that we built didn't have a name for the longest time, and then my team and I, we were talking, and we were just like, "Guys, what do we call this? Because like we don't have a name for it." And so we came up with all these acronyms,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we just looked at a bunch of them. And Iris really stood out because Iris is actually the Greek goddess of communication and emotion. And so we saw that, we're like, what a perfect name for what we're building. So yeah, we call it Iris. Iris is our model that we licensed for B2B customers,
Mm-hmm.
and people love it. And it generates money for them. It generates revenue. It generates engagement. So it's doing its job.
So a couple of questions here. So one, are there examples? I mean, one, if you thinking early on in Goodable, or now, if you're sharing your own content, and like you want to try to ensure it's going to be engaged with in a positive way, whatever that means. Like, can you share an example of like, here's something you or the team or someone thought, they ran it through Iris, and did that lead to like a change in framing, a change in language, so something that's not necessarily commercial, but just content.
So here's an exact case, right? So one of our partners actually runs, I think it's tens of thousands of API calls per day. I don't know the exact number, but it's a good number. And sometimes we'll see the same content running through the API. And
Mm-hmm.
we'll be like, oh, but they just ran this through the API based on the headline. Like they ran it through
Mm-hmm.
the API an hour ago. And what we actually realized was that they were running it through the API after several updates. So they'd update the article, run it through again, update the article, run it again, and the score kept going up and up. And what that meant was that there was an editor somewhere at that organization that was telling the writer, your tone is too negative. Your tone is actually like emotionally harmful. It could be a story about like a new budget that your state
Mm-hmm.
legislature passed, so technically neutral. But the language that the writer was using was inflammatory. And Iris picked up on that and said, listen, your score and your output's really low here. It probably shouldn't be this low because it's a neutral story. So this is how some of our partners have been using ISIS to like optimize what they write. Very soon, we're going to make Iris available to just ordinary users, and it works just like Grammarly. So the same way
Mm-hmm.
that Grammarly lives on your desktop or an extension, and you highlight a paragraph, Grammarly will tell you, hey, the punctuation is wrong. Use this word instead of that word. You will be able through Iris to highlight a piece of text, and it will instantly tell you the emotional impact of that content before the user ever sees it. So the use cases would be like maybe you're a CEO and you're writing a company update and you have to announce layoffs.
Mm-hmm.
It happens all the time. CEOs tend to be really tone deaf when it comes to writing this stuff. And nobody ever looked at a CEO email and said, wow, I feel bad for that CEO.
Yeah.
And we just think, what an evil person and an evil corporation. So that's a use case where they'd be able to run Iris on their content before they hit send on that email. And we will actually optimize it for them to like make it feel like it's empathetic and like a real person, and that you have feelings and that you care about the words and the language that you use. So it's a really exciting time for us.
So quite interesting. I've been living. My wife's from Colombia. We met during our PhDs, and Medellin, has gone through a radical transformation. Still has so many challenges. Still lots of criminality and poverty and infrastructure challenges and corruption, but also lots of positive things. And I've lived all over the world, traveled a lot. And Medellin is also really good at marketing. And they actually have I've never seen this anywhere else in the world. Like, in the US, if you do an infrastructure project, there might be something, oh, we did this. But Medellin, some people would critique it. They spend money. Like I just was walking today after an appointment, there's a thing saying like, Medellin, we care about each other. Like, so there's all these kind of messages. It's not just saying, hey, we did this for education infrastructure, but like, and it was the first metro system in Colombia. They call it Cultura de Metro. So like, there's a really like almost civic education campaign that's also often tied to advertising and communication. So are there examples of how Iris is being used, at a civic level? I'm thinking of like, Google's Jigsaw or some of the tools they're building where, it's either used to kind of communicate or to look, Jigsaw and some others have some really interesting tools that are trying to look, when whether it's doing online or in-person facilitation around contentious issues, try to look for commonalities. So
Yeah.
has Iris been used either in a public policy or kind of citizen setting, or is there potential for that?
We're partnering with with governments. And so the interesting use case there for us is as a method of, I wouldn't say like creating language that sort of unites people, but rather as a way to reduce stress and anxiety. So here's a use case is, um, on a transit system, for example. Transit operators have some of the highest stress jobs in the world. In any major city, transit systems deal with high levels of crime, a number of violent incidents on the transit network, long hours. I mean, if you're a subway operator in some major cities, you're not seeing sunlight for 8 hours a day, right? And so as a result, absentee rates are really high. One of the things that Iris does is it sort of looks at all of the communication touch points that that person receives. So let's say you're a subway operator in like a major city like, I don't know, Toronto or New York, right? What are all the points during that operator's day where you could sort of remind them that there's goodness in the world? It's on their phone, it's on the screens that they see on the platform, it's maybe even on the advertisements that you see in the subway train itself. There's all these different touch points. And so we've started deploying Goodable um, at some government levels to start to experiment and see like how we can change absentee rates, how we can change workforce productivity, how we can just boost morale in the office through these things that we take for granted. Like, there's um we partner with a lot of amazing screen management companies. So when you walk into a large like skyscraper, there are screens everywhere. The skyscraper doesn't actually manage those screens. They just outsource it to like some other company. And so that other company usually thinks, hey, what do we put on these screens so that people will watch? And they have like usually like a news ticker or like headlines or something. And the problem with that was a lot of these companies were using headlines that were making people feel really bad. Like you could work on Wall Street and you'd look at, the television screen and it would say stock just collapsed by like 5,000%. And you work on Wall Street, right? And like your mind's gonna say, oh, great, we're all gonna get laid off. It means I didn't do my job. And so those partners actually started coming to us and saying, hey, listen, can we start running Goodable content on those screens? And they did. And what happens now is that they run us more than they run any other content. And the reason why is from a basic like startup user perspective, what's the best user experience you can provide? If you're a bank, you don't want people lining up in the branch to be looking at a screen saying, hey, inflation is going up because you're struggling to pay your bill. So Goodable kind of is solving that problem. We're not really at the policy level yet. But it's interesting that you mentioned that because I think that's the natural outcome of this is that it will eventually grow to the policy level where you will have local city councilors or even like prime ministers who will step up and say, hey, like based on the data that we've seen here, we need to start thinking on a policy level about how to manage our language and our content to build bridges rather than destroy them. So I think that's the end outcome of this.
Right. So I was listening to a podcast, maybe from New York Times. I don't know if it was Hard Fork or somebody this week, who has done a lot of research on gambling, spent a lot of their life in gambling. It was a professor, and just looking at gaming. But then they started noticing about 15 years ago that a lot of the tech companies are using the same type of gamification things, to get people engaged. So kind of a question for you, but also in general for technology is part of like, if I go into my kid is 15, likes to go to the mall. So if we go to the mall, there could be content that is like, and he wants some. He hasn't been into brand names, but like he wanted to spend money on a shirt. I thought it was a waste of money, but it has the brand. So like your technology or any technology could be done. Like feel good, buy this shirt, or like do this. To induce or to help people kind of think about purchasing something or doing some action. So what are your thoughts about how Goodable or other technology is used, maybe not so much in the addictive sense, but to induce, whether it's Colgate or,
Yeah.
Coca-Cola or an
Well,
electric car company.
so that technology already exists, and
Yeah.
we're being exposed to it every day. So, for
Yeah.
example, like all these ad platforms know they have data on you. They know you very well. They have your profile. They know what you shop, where you shop it, where you live. Probably know if you have kids. Probably know like your kids' names. Like it's kind of
Yeah.
creepy the amount of data that they have. But they also know, for example, when you're hungry.
Mhm.
So if you're online searching for pizza, within the next 20 minutes, you're going to get served ads
Mhm.
from like a pizza place saying, "Hey, we have a 2-for-1 special." Like Uber is really good at this. Uber is fantastic at this because when you want to order Uber Eats, you order from one restaurant, it automatically knows that's the type of cuisine this guy likes, and he just logged in and he started looking at the same cuisine. He means that they're probably hungry.
Mhm.
So that technology exists and it works. And ad tech is so advanced that ad tech will actually sort of like know, hey, this person is prime for conversion.
Yeah.
Meaning like, if we give them a 5% discount to this Broadway show and we serve it to them at 6 p.m., there's a really good chance they're going to click on it and purchase. So they optimize for things like your user behavior, but they don't optimize for your emotional state.
Mhm.
And the potential of this is really interesting because, like, what's a good example? Like if someone who has depression is less likely to go and spend money at a restaurant
Mhm.
than someone who doesn't have depression.
Mhm.
And so if you can start targeting users based on their emotional state, it opens up lots of possibilities. For example, some of the partners that we partner with, like Goodable is on some of their screens in restaurants. And what they've told us is like, we love having Goodable on in the restaurant because our customers tip more money than they normally do.
Mhm.
Right. So there's like a direct business use case there. The waiters like it because they make more money. The restaurants like it. The diners like it because they're not watching some 24-hour news feed. They're watching something that makes them feel good. So there's a lot of data that shows people will spend more money and drive business outcomes if they're in a good mood.
Mhm.
And so that's something that like we know that Goodable does.
And how do you? I mean, I'm just thinking. I spent a lot of time in the Balkans in the '90s. This is totally different,
Oh wow.
And I was not in the war areas, but was around a lot of people who were displaced. I'm just thinking in Serbia in the early '90s, like propaganda machine. So how do
Yeah.
you avoid this technology? Like, I mean, because there's always dual use for everything. And I'm not saying you in specific, but obviously I did a consultancy last year for the International Panel on the Information Environment and looked at the negative and positive uses of AI for peace. So it's like the same thing for this. Like, yes, there's ad tech, and if you think of, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, which was, version, like now it's 20, 30 times worse. So the idea that this kind of technology could be used to manipulate or not like force people, but whether it's on propaganda or spend money, like DraftKings, spend money you don't have, or so how do, like, what are the safeguards either that Goodable has or that you think the industry at large, or is there safeguards about how this is being used?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So, a couple of thoughts on that is number one, we won't partner with companies or organizations that are not that we don't believe are force for good in the world. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, we've been approached by maybe like some like mining companies, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and like not to say they don't do good, but that's just something that doesn't align with like it's very tricky for us to like partner with them if they're creating environmental damage or things like that. So that's one. I mean, there might be some mining companies that are doing very ethical jobs and like actually responsible, and like we're happy to partner with those. We also wouldn't partner with um, like some governments, for example. Like I wouldn't do that. Like we're not in the business of trying to whitewash like government crimes or anything like that. So
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't partner there. Um, the second part of this answer is um, yeah, you could manipulate user emotions to drive specific outcomes. You could manipulate the way that people vote, for example, by sort of
Mm-hmm.
like exposing them to certain content. I think the safeguard is actually in user behavior that already exists. And what I mean by that is, at the beginning of the show, I talked about how I grew up watching the National at 10 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody does that anymore. Like nobody Like appointment viewing is just over. Like it doesn't really
Mm-hmm.
exist anymore, right? And so an average person consumes news from multiple sources every day. And I don't just mean news, I mean just information in general, right? Like you call it whatever you want, but when you're consuming information that informs you about the world, you're not getting it from one place. You're getting it from YouTube, you're getting it from your Twitter feed, you're getting it from your friend or your aunt that's messaging you on WhatsApp. Like you're getting information from all sorts of places. As long as people continue to get information from multiple sources, everything will be fine. It'll all be
Mm-hmm.
okay. If somebody says, "Hey, listen, Goodable is the only source that I go to for all information," I would say you probably shouldn't do that. You should probably like diversify. And I think that's the trick. So, yes, you can, quote, brainwash people if they're only being fed a steady diet of good news. What we found with our own user base is about 10% of users come to us as like super users. They use the product every day, they use our app, they love us, they're the ones that share with their friends. But 90% of people consume content from other places. It's
Mm-hmm.
a similar analogy to Whole Foods. We're trying to be the Whole Foods of like the internet world and use our AI as a force for good. Most people, like 90% of people will go to Whole Foods for specific items. There's a specific like kombucha or organic sushi or
Mm-hmm.
something that you need and you'll get it from Whole Foods, but then you'll go to like a regular supermarket for the rest of your stuff because this is cheaper. About 10% of Whole Foods users only go to Whole Foods. Like they don't care how much money they spend. They'll just only go to Whole Foods because that's what they believe in. And our numbers sort of mirror that same ratio. And so for 90% of people, they come to us as part of their daily diet, but they'll watch Tucker Carlson or they'll watch, right wing sources or left wing sources. Like they have a pretty steady diet. So our goal is to be part of the diet, not to replace the entire thing.
And would you, would you use the phrasing "whole news" or like do you have like an analogy? Like, I mean,
That's a good one. We should
like
actually. I never thought of that, but
like what if you had to think of the analogy and what how would you describe, and especially since you've gone more business B2B than B2C, so like are you curators, are you helping organizations understand the potential positive and negative impact of the content they're sharing,
yeah.
so how do you differentiate between B2C, between direct to customers and business to
Yeah.
business?
So what we are now is that we are an infrastructure layer that optimizes content for emotional outcomes. That's the technical sort of like if you look at our deck, that's like a very direct way of saying. Some investors have started calling us Grammarly for emotion,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of interesting to us because it's understandable. The mechanism isn't exactly the same because Grammarly is a consumer product that consumers use. And I get it, they have enterprise subscriptions, but it's understood as a consumer product. What we do actually lives behind the scenes. So if Goodable, if Iris is doing its job, then no one will even know it's there, right? Suddenly your content feed will just be 10% happier. And if we could do that, then it's working. It should never be 100% happier, but if we
Mm-hmm.
could get to 10%, then it's working. So that's really what we are, is we're an AI powered infrastructure layer that modifies and optimizes how content is served.
Okay. And just to get back to an example, you talked about restaurants and, you know, where a, let's say either individual restaurant or a chain would start showing Goodable content, usually through a third party provider. And obviously, like, I'm just thinking, like, my kid has braces, so we have to go to the dentist a lot. Luckily, the dentist here doesn't show stupid stuff, but I get angry when I go to most medical professionals because like the things they have on TV are just ridiculous. Like, so like what is it that is shown like in a restaurant or a medical office?
Dude,
Like, can you give some
dude,
context?
I was I was in a hospital in the
Mm-hmm.
emergency room. I think I twisted my ankle or something after playing a game. And I was in the hospital in the emergency room, and they had a news channel on the screens. And the news channel was talking about a shooting in downtown Toronto and how the victims were rushed to hospital. And the victim was literally down the hall, screaming in agony because he'd been shot. And when you're in an emergency room, because everyone's rushing to that thing and you hear them saying gunshot wound and this and that. And you're like, damn, I didn't need to see that on my
Yeah.
screen. Right? And the same is for a dentist office. Like you're getting a root canal and you want to watch a story about a murder like in your neighborhood, like it's just a bad user experience. Banks make this mistake all the time. When you walk into a bank branch, there's like a ticker and like stocks just. Why are you telling people their stocks just went down when they're going to the bank to make a deposit? Like, there's all these really weird user experiences that don't sync. And I look at this and I'm like, why would somebody do this? And the answer is like, they don't even know. Like when you talk to hospitals and you're like, why do you put that on the screen? They're like, well, what else would we put?
Mm-hmm.
And my answer is like, damn, you need Goodable. Like you need something that's just going to give people hope and joy. And like, there's a huge opportunity for us as a startup to go to these places. So the short answer is like, I feel this pain as much as you do when I go to these places.
Yeah. But can you share like an example? So if a hospital or a restaurant or any hotel, like what would be when you say put Goodable or like Goodable filtered content, like what would be
Yeah,
an example? So they're not showing the horrible news, but they're showing what?
here's an example, right? So I travel a lot, and every time I check into a hotel, I think it's like Hilton or Marriott or the main ones. There's a Wi-Fi page, and you log into it's everybody goes through this. There's a Wi-Fi page. You put in your room number or whatever, and you get your Wi-Fi access. As soon as you click connect, it takes you to a page where there's some news feed on that page. It may not be at the top, but there's like a news widget. I was once in a city where I logged in, and the number one story after I logged into the Wi-Fi was about a fire at a hotel in the same city that I was just visiting.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, why on earth would they do this? So what Goodable would do is we would actually optimize our AI to say, okay, if the user is in Medellin, right? I'm sure there's like negative news that comes out of there too, right?
Oh, so much negative news. Yeah.
Like, so our thing would be, okay, if you're checking into a hotel in Medellin, do you want your first story to be about like, a cartel shooting or something like at the beach? Or do you want it to showcase something good that happened in Medellin? For example, maybe there was like a conservation initiative or a clean the beach initiative, or maybe it's an announcement saying, hey, on Friday, come to this beach because we're doing a community cleanup.
Mm-hmm.
Like think of the difference in user perspective. You arrive in a new city, the first thing you see is crime. Or you arrive in a new city and you see community coming together to make the place better. Both are true. Yes, there was crime, and yes, the community is coming together. If you're the owner of that property, you have a choice. Do you choose bad or do you choose good? Good will always win. And I'm not saying ignore the bad. The bad will always exist and it will find a way to get to users. But the owners and the people that make that decision have a choice, and if you show them side by side, they will always choose good. That's just human nature. We're just driven towards like stories of hope and inspiration, and that's what our AI surfaces for our partners.
So I want to ask a couple of questions before we finish about being a founder. So one thing just on the hiring end. So when you have hired or have been hiring, whether it's for consultants or tech teams or staff, we had on the podcast last week the head of impact for the Pulitzer Center. I forget the chief impact officer. She's Brazilian. And it was interesting because she talked about she's been doing recruiting for 5 positions, and with AI slop, she's gotten 2,000 applications almost per position. So there's 2 questions. They're like, what do you look for? And then in this age of kind of increasing AI generation of everything, how do candidates make a difference?
Yeah. So the number one rule, if you're hiring for people, especially at a startup, is hire slow and fire fast. Take your time when you're hiring, get to know them, have them meet members of your team if they can, see some of their work. So for important technical roles, we'll actually administer like a test, like an exam, and we want to see the results. And it's not whether they were right or wrong. It shows us how they think through problem solving. So that's important. Hire slow, fire fast. Most startups do the opposite. They hire way too fast, which is what we did, and we hired way too slow. I have an unwavering belief in the competency of the people that I hire. And it's very hard for me to accept that, no, I made a mistake and we shouldn't have hired them. We made some mistakes early on and I learned from them. And I said, okay, I have to stop doing this. Like hey, everybody is a good person at heart, but you may just not be the right person for this role. It's not a reflection of their value as a person. It's just, you don't fit. It's like a square peg in a round hole. So if you're hiring, you have to understand this very quickly and get to know people before you hire them. And if they're not working, end it quickly. It's better for everybody. On the AI slop, anyone that comes through a referral immediately goes to the top of my list. Every single person we've hired has come through a referral, either through an accelerator we were part of or a friend knew somebody. And that's how we brought them on board. And so if you're looking for a job at a startup, the first thing I would do is like, yeah, you can go on the job board and submit your resume, but you're going to be with 2,000 other people, right? And who may not even be real. The first thing I would do is I would write a short, cold email to the founder or the CEO, no more than 6 sentences, tell them why you want to work for them, and just personalize it. You don't even need to add a resume. Like at that point, you don't need to. Just send a personal cold email. And you'd be surprised how well a nicely written personal cold email actually delivers results.
Yep. I was just corresponding with a friend today that he was working in finance and he wanted to move to social impact. We met him at a career fair. We were not looking to hire somebody. And then he worked just part-time as a consultant with us on and off for years. And we're still in touch. It was like, it's that kind of being in the right place, but also having the right attitude. I want to ask a question came in that I was debating between this. This is from Felipe. Thanks for your question. Is your business model based solely on subscriptions, or do you expect to sell advertisements as well? So I guess, can you talk a little bit more? So you started mostly B2C, business to consumer through the app, and now you're much more B2B in terms of like your, obviously nothing confidential, but your revenue stream. So you're mostly now a B2B company providing this AI infrastructure for emotional intelligence, and then you have the app. And then related to that is like, if someone is curious about Goodable, whether they're a founder, they have their own company, or just an individual, like what products or services are you providing now?
So on the consumer side, like for example, we have our app, which is actually clinically proven to reduce anxiety and depression. It's run through multiple clinical trials. It's very functional. It's great. We deploy it not just to consumers, but also like on an enterprise level. So we have some organizations where the entire organization has been onboarded as Goodable users on the app. For those customers at the enterprise level, we offer certain features that we don't offer for the consumer side. So if you're a consumer user, you'll get full access to Goodable. If you're an enterprise user, whenever your company does something good, we'll feed it through Goodable and you'll get it as a push alert. So for example, like some companies volunteer with Habitat for Humanity, which is great. Like I wish all companies did that. When your company builds its first home with Habitat for Humanity, usually there's like a picture or a press release. We'll push that out on Goodable only to those users at that company, say, hey, good news, look, your company did something great. In both cases, it's a subscription model. So the consumer subscription it's less than a cost of like a latte per month to subscribe to Goodable on the app. If you're watching this podcast, listening to this podcast, please download it, goodable.app. I'd love to see you as part of our community. It'll really change your life. On the enterprise level, they also pay subscriptions. It's just a different subscription tier. So we have like the consumer tier and then the enterprise tier. For our AI partnerships, again, it's a typical SaaS model. So it's a typical SaaS model where there's different subscription tiers. Obviously, the pricing is much higher because it's enterprise grade, but that's the same thing. It's usually driven by the number of API calls that they want to make per month, and there's pricing accordingly. So it's 100% subscription model, whether it's the API or the consumer, and we don't have any advertisements at all. I think journalism, or let me take that back. I think content should attract interest, not like cater towards advertisers. It is just a personal thing. Like I just don't like seeing ads everywhere I go. And when we built Goodable, we said, look, let's just avoid ads altogether. And also the advertising model is kind of broken because when ad rates are good, you're doing well. And ad rates are out of your control. So 1 year, if ad rates are down, you go bankrupt. And so we thought, like, what's a more stable way to grow the startup? And subscriptions are the way that we're doing it.
So I want to finish up with 2 questions. We respect your time. So the first one, just very simple. What is the best channel to follow you and Goodable on? So LinkedIn. I mean, do you have blogs? Do you have a newsletter? I mean, obviously there's the app, but for people who just want to understand what you're doing as a person and what Goodable is doing as a company.
So the first I would say is download the app. It's there's a free section where you don't have to actually pay for a subscription. You'll still get a number of positive stories every day. It'll change your life, change your outlook. It'll just make you happier. You'll share it with your friends. Download the app. Just go to goodable.app or just go to the Google Play Store or iOS App Store and download it. That's the first thing. If you care about being a positive force in the world, then support our mission and download the apps. On the web, we actually just launched and we came out of beta a new website called thedailygoods.com. So thedailygoods.com. It's 100% free. Eventually, a lot of that content will be behind a paywall, but for right now, it's free. Anyone can go there. Just make it part of your daily habit. Like if you like it, keep coming back. That's the second place. And then the third place is, I guess, find us on socials. We're having an issue with Instagram right now, so you won't find us there, and which is unfortunate, and it's really a big pain point for us. But just find us at Goodable on TikTok, on Facebook, on Twitter/X, and follow us.
Okay. And then last two questions. So where do you go? So obviously I was a media fellow at a conference with one of the founders of Solutions Journalism. So I think of them as a peer thing. We're going to have Jack Brewster next week. I don't know, he's doing some really interesting stuff with media, but where do you go to find kind of colleagues to read inspiration? So like both like the business of news and also kind of AI for impact. So any favorite conferences, podcasts, newsletters, blogs, or just places that you go where you're just like, that is so interesting. Not the sad things, but the inspiring things.
So I'm going to give a different answer here. And it's an answer that I was given during it many years ago during a job interview. They asked me where I get my news from. And so I tried to list the most neutral sources that I could. So I said like AP, Reuters, like occasionally Dow Jones or Bloomberg, and I thought it was the right answer. And they said, yeah, but how do you know what the other side is thinking? And they were right, because I'd surrounded myself with sources that sort of reinforced my worldview, but I wasn't reading anything from the other side of the aisle that challenged me. So my answer to you is a little bit different. I would say, look, whatever your own beliefs are or your preferences are, or political views or whatever, make sure to read what the opposite side thinks. So for example, in America, it's very polarized. So people who watch CNN typically don't watch Fox News. If you really want to know what America is, you probably have to watch both. And I'm not saying you have to like it, but you have to at least understand what the other side is thinking. So I would say expand whatever your favorite newsletter is, find someone with a different opinion and then start consuming them as well. I think that would solve a lot of problems in America.
Yeah. And also I think just friendships, that we have friends from all different perspectives, and some of their points of views I think are crazy and vice versa, but it's like, you can't just be friends with people who think the same. Last question, any book, show, or just something that's been occupying your brain in a good way, doesn't need to have anything to do with work, which again, like that, something is like super interesting, aha, or you just you keep coming back to?
I mean, I have a lot of very eclectic interests that are like really surprising. I'm really into traditional mysticism, which I just find really fascinating. Perennial philosophy is another one that I'll read anything that has to do with perennial philosophy. I think in terms of like becoming a literate consumer of information, there was a book that was published, I think it was in 1953, maybe earlier, called The Image, by Boorstin, Boorstin. It was one of the first books I read in journalism school, and it's such a gripping takedown of everything wrong with the media industry. And like everything that we're talking about now is like sort of the collapse of truth and like how you can manipulate people. It all goes back to this one book, and he was like he had these like prophetic sort of observations that like people kind of laughed at him in the 50s, because he was just talking about like printed word and printed images. And he talked about how you can manipulate people through that. I think it's mandatory reading for anybody that wants to know the state of media today, is read that book.
Yep. Thank you so much. I'm always reading and listening to a million books. I started reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which gets into all this stuff too. Like, it's 100 years old, but it's all the stuff about media and bias. So thank you so much for your time and energy and all the work you're doing at Goodable and the impact you've had and sharing your journey. So again, all the things we talked about will be in the show notes, so you don't have to stress about this. Apologies on my part. Again, LinkedIn didn't work. That was something in the tech end. It did stream to YouTube. And again, as we started off, please download Goodable. Check out thedailygoods.com. Please follow Mohammed. Share the podcast or any podcast, and keep working for impact. And again, like talking to you and using the app gives me a lot more inspiration. And last night, I do remember during COVID, John Krasinski did that. I forgot, you had that, like that YouTube thing, which was amazing. So, I mean, this, I wonder if you ever talked to him, because it was like something similar. It's like, this is just good news at the midst of like, one of the worst times in modern history. So I feel like he should be like,
so, he did, I think, 5 episodes, and Goodable was in 2 or 3 of them.
Okay.
Like, I would wake up the next morning and people would say, hey, like, I saw you on Krasinski. And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, there was like a story that you posted where he, like, I guess there was like a screenshot of the tweet or something that he included. So it was really cool. And what's interesting is that I think he was bought by CBS. He sold the franchise, and then I don't know what they did with it. I feel like they didn't really grow it. But there were 9 bidders for that series. Yeah, 9 bidders, and only one of them got them. And this was around the time that we were just building Goodable. And so it gave me hope that, like, as a founder, you look for like market demand. And I was like, dude, there's market demand. If 9 people bidded on that and only one like won the agreement, that means there's 8 other people out there that could use Goodable. So that was interesting.
Yeah, but maybe as we finish, there's a great Australian startup called Human Ticks, which does, you might have heard of, but they sell tickets, but they give, it's kind of like a ticket master or something, but they're ethical. So they donate a huge percentage of profits to philanthropy. So Hugh Jackman, I think, I saw a headline, I haven't read it yet, but Hugh Jackman, I think, is now going to be like a brand ambassador. So I feel like John Krasinski, like, anyway, so we'll finish